So, how to declare an array and how to work with an array. Um, so, the way we declare an array is kind of similar how we declare scalar variables. So, it starts with a dim or a private based on the scope of the variable, what can access the variable. Uh, but the difference here is that after the variable name or the array name, there are a couple of parentheses which we need to use for when we are defining or declaring arrays. Now there's two way of defining it. So um, you can right there and then say how many um, items the array is gonna have, or how many elements the array is gonna have, and that's by putting a number for the highest subscript of the array. Meaning that if you are if you want an array of, let's say, 5 elements, so you put 4 in between parentheses, meaning that it will have 5 elements, the first one starting off with 0. So when you do that, dim or private, then array name, highest subscript, and then like scalar variables, you have to define or you have to declare the data type, whether it's a string or integer or a decimal, and it can be anything um, like variables, like scalar variables can be any type of data type, but all of them have the same data type. Now, another way of defining arrays is that you don't put any highest subscript within the parentheses. You just after the array name, you just put the two parentheses, and then after defining the data type, you then populate the array, meaning that you size the array um, by giving initial values in the array. So like either put some values like whatever you want to, meaning that so you're defining what the initial values of each element in the array will be. uh, if you did not define the initial values, by default the computer will define initial values. Like if you're defining some numbers, is all of them is going to be 0. If you're defining strings, each element will be an empty string. If you're defining boolean, then all of them are going to be false. But if you choose not to let the computer handle it and you handle it by putting some numbers or some values there, that's the version 2 of the syntax. Now we have a few examples here. So the first one is dim cities in parentheses 3, meaning that we are defining a string array named cities having 4 elements, not 3, because it starts from 0 and goes to 3, so we have 4 elements. The second example is defining an integer array called numbers, and see here it's private, meaning that it's like a class variable. So all the sub functions and subroutines can access this variable. When you want something like that, you define it as private, not as dim. So it has like a class scope instead of a module scope. So but anyway, so numbers 5 is basically declaring a 6 element module level array named numbers, and each element is automatically initialized to 0. And the third one, the sales has been initially defined by the user, like the initial values of the variables have been defined, and they are decimal values: 75, 33, 6.89, 9.65, and all that. So by defining the initial values, you have already said that it's going to be a 4 element array. It's going to be a decimal, and it will have these as your initial value. Now we already talked about one way of populating arrays, meaning that putting numbers inside the array, and that's by setting the initial values Another way is after you define in the first version by just putting the highest amount of subscript and not initializing it, and then you can um, like assign strings or any type of data to each element one by one, each element of the array. So that's example one, where you're assigning the string Madrid to the first element of the cities array, and that's why it has a subscript of 0. And then you can put cities 1 equals to some other city. So you can do it like that. Or if there's a certain pattern in your population of the array, then you can use for loops or any kind of loops. That's example 2. um, so you basically there the counter is x and it goes from 1 to 6, and there's number x minus 1 is equals to x times x, or x multiplied by x, which is x square. So it assigns the squares of the numbers from 0 through 1, from 1 through 6 to the numbers array. And it's x minus 1 because the first element in the array has a subscript of 0. So to access that, and the for loop starts with 1. So I mean the first element in the for loop has a counter value of 1, whereas the first element in the numbers array has a counter value of, or a subscript value of 0, and so on. So the second element in the counter has the number 2, while the second element in the array has a subscript of 1. So it's always x minus 1. That's why. And third example is just try parsing the text from a sales text box to a decimal and assigning it to an element of the sales array. That's the third element because it has a subscript of 2. So after you define an array, you can use these subscripts to assign something to any element in the array.